Hello and welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, the Irish Daily Star and Irish Mirror's crime podcast. I'm Paul Healy, I'm crime correspondent for both papers, and I'm joined by Michael O'Toole, the crime and defence editor with both papers. This is the 8th day of the trial of Jozef Puska. He is accused of the murder of Ashling Murphy in Tullamore, County Offaly on the 12th of January 2022, and he has pleaded not guilty to that charge. Today, the evidence dealt with the alleged confession by Mr Puska, which happened in hospital in 2022. And we're going to hear about that evidence now from Michael. So, Michael, how was today?
A very busy day today, Paul. We didn't finish until after 4 o'clock. I think it usually finishes around 3:45, doesn't it?
Yeah, 3:45, 4 o'clock. Yeah, although one or two of the days it has ran a bit later. Yeah.
So we had, you're quite right, Paul. We had 6 witnesses today, all Gardaí, 3 from Blanchardstown Garda Station in West Dublin, and 3 from, County Offaly. 2 are from Birr Garda Station, and 1 is from Tullamore, but they were all effectively part of the investigation into the killing and alleged murder of Ashling Murphy on the 12th of January in Cappincur, as you say, in 2022.
Mm-hmm. And now we're going to go through each of the witnesses as we always do, but I think we propose to start with, I suppose, what you would call one of the main witnesses of the day, in that his evidence was the longest, and there's quite a bit of material to go through. And that witness was Detective Sergeant Brian Jennings.
Yes, so you're quite right, Paul. So he was witness number 4, but I think it's fair to say he was on the stand for the longest. So we heard that he is a detective sergeant in Birr Garda Station, which is part of the Offaly district, or the Laois Offaly division, I believe, but it's not, obviously, it's separate from Tullamore Garda Station. But he did confirm that he was part of the Ashling Murphy investigation team. Now, obviously, it's alleged that Miss Murphy was murdered on the 12th of January, but Detective Sergeant Jennings told the court he wasn't involved from day one. He only became involved on the 13th, which I believe was a Thursday, so he wasn't involved in day one. Now, he said he was tasked with a number of jobs. Initially, they mostly involved taking statements from witnesses. One interesting point, he just gave an insight into typical investigation like this. He said there could be between 500 and 1,000 what he called jobs or tasks. So up to 1,000 different investigative jobs that has to be done, and obviously they're handled out to different Gardaí and different units and that sort of thing. But he says that on the 13th, he was tasked in the evening to go to St James's Hospital in Dublin. Now, we know that on the 13th, Mr Puska was taken by ambulance from his parents' house in Crumlin. Early in the morning of the 13th, he was taken by ambulance from Crumlin to St James's Hospital, and he said that he had been stabbed. So we know, and we'll talk later on, that 3 Gardaí from Blanchardstown were in attendance with Mr Puska, and as a result of that, an inspector, who I'll hear more from in a while, called Shane McCartan, contacted Gardaí in Tullamore as part of the murder investigation. And as a result of that, Detective Sergeant Jennings and his colleague Detective Garda, Fergus Hogan, who's also from Tullamore Birr Garda Station, went to St James's Hospital on the night of the 13th. Now, they got in about 9:15, had a chat with 2 Gardaí from Blanchardstown, went into the hospital, and Detective Sergeant Jennings said his purpose was to see if he could speak to Mr Puska. Now, he had a conversation with the doctor, but did not get to speak to Mr Puska, and he told the court that he believed Mr Puska was in theatre. So they left the hospital. They went back to the hospital the next day. So that is the January the 14th. I think that was a Friday. And he told the court he arrived at approximately 11:40 in the morning. And he was aware that Mr Puska was now in a ward, St Bennett's ward, I believe. And he went there. He identified himself to nurses, the nurses' station. And he asked if he could speak to Mr Puska. He told the court that the staff were happy with that, and a nurse brought him down to Mr Puska's room. Now, he walked in, it was room 22. It was a 6-bed room or ward, shall we say, so a shared ward really. And so there were 2 rows of 3 beds, if you will. And Mr Puska was in the middle bed of one of the rows, but he wasn't in bed. He was sitting in a chair beside the bed, and he was awake. Now, the first thing that Detective Sergeant Jennings said that he noticed were visible scratches on the hands, face, and forehead of Mr Puska. He then told Mr Puska that they were investigating the murder of Ashling Murphy in Tullamore, and he said he was conversing. The witness said that Mr Puska was conversing with him. He appeared to be okay, but he did appear to be in pain, and he said he was doing a bit of dry retching. The witness then said that he asked Mr Puska if he was happy to speak to them after identifying. They both identified themselves as Gardaí and showed their official identification. And he told the court that Mr Puska said he was. So he went to a nurse to get help with facilitating an interpreter. As we know, Mr Puska is a Slovakian national. So he was taken out of his shared ward and wheeled, I think, on the chair into a separate office, and the sergeant rang for an interpreter in that office and put him on a speaker. So the Mr Puska and the interpreter started talking to each other, and Detective Sergeant Jennings took a note of that conversation. Now, he timed it at 12:20 on the 14th of January. So he then, and it may have been a bit pell-mell for anybody reading my notes, because essentially what happened was Detective Sergeant Jennings then started reading his notes quite rapid fire, as anybody reading notes will say. So he essentially read out notes in which Mr Puska said that he went to his mother's house and that it had been very bad, and that his mother lives in Crumlin, and that he couldn't stand up. He was then asked, how did he said that he had gone from Tullamore to Crumlin, or to Dublin on the 12th, and he was asked who drove him, and he said, a friend called Tom. What car was it? It was a blue Octavia. And then he said, where are your clothes from the day? And he said he threw them all in a bin at his parents. He thinks they're in a bag. So the driver left him at Houston Station, and from there he said that he got a taxi, which he paid for by cash, to Blanchardstown in West Dublin. He was asked why, and he said he was going to meet a girl. He said he was asked, does he have his phone? He said he doesn't have it either. It must have been stolen or must have been dropped. He said the girl that he was going to meet didn't know her second name. He thinks she was from Hungary, and her name was possibly Marion. And so at this stage, the sergeant gives a sort of commentary, and he said that he and Detective Garda Hogan were both asking questions, and he is saying that Mr Puska is freely speaking. The interpreter struggled to keep up with him. In other words, he was speaking so quickly. He was fully awake, he was engaging, and he was providing information. He said, how did he contact this lady that he said was Marion? He said he found her phone number in his phone at one stage and decided to meet up with her. He originally had his number, her number on a piece of paper at home. He found it at home and saved it onto his phone. He was asked, did his wife know that he was going to Dublin? Yes. But did she know that he was going on a date? She said no. So then he talks about what happened in Blanchardstown when he alleged he was attacked. He got out of the car. He said it was about a kilometre from the centre of Balbriggan, I suppose. Two guys attacked him. One grabbed him. The second fella took a knife and stabbed him, and he may have lost consciousness. He said he then managed to escape, and he got a taxi to Crumlin. He was asked, was there much blood on him? He said not much, maybe on his jumper, but he couldn't walk probably, and he was walking slowly. I mentioned earlier that Detective Sergeant Jennings noticed scratches on him, and he put that, he said, how did you get the scratches? And Mr Puska said they came during the attack when they dragged him. Now then, Detective Sergeant Jennings asked Mr Puska, have you a bike? And he said, yes, it's green and black, but it was stolen from Mucklagh. We'll know that Mr Puska has an address at Lynally Grove in Mucklagh. He was then asked, was he in Tullamore on a bike on Wednesday? So that's the 12th of January, the day that Miss Murphy was allegedly murdered. And he said no. So the interview lasted about 40 minutes. Now, the interview ended. I think after that, we will hear that under cross-examination, he said he contacted Gardaí at the incident room, the investigation base at Tullamore, and they were directed to stay at the hospital. So after 6 p.m, he and Detective Garda Hogan stayed there till about 6 p.m, when he was informed by phone call that another detective sergeant was on her way to the hospital with a warrant. So that was Detective Sergeant Pamela Nugent, who is from Tullamore. Now, she'll give evidence later, but essentially she arrived at about 6:25. He met her, brought her, and the warrant did say the warrant was for St James's Hospital, but there was particular reference made on the warrant to Jozef Puska, so they wanted his clothes and his phone. And she also said later in her own evidence that the warrant also allowed for a pre-treatment or pre-operation blood sample to be taken that had been taken from Mr Puska, so she got that as well.
Yeah, so I understand, Mick, then that they met each other in the ward. They met each other, and they went then to the ward to meet Mr Puska for what would be the second interview.
Yes, so Sergeant Jennings met Sergeant Duncan in the reception area, really, or the lobby of the hospital, and they went up to St Bennett's ward again, and Sergeant Nugent presented the warrant. Mr Puska was brought from the room, his ward again, into a private room this time. He was wheeled up in a bed into a single room, and Sergeant Nugent said Sergeant Nugent presented Mr Puska with the warrant that had his name on it.
And when they presented that warrant, then what was said next to Mr Puska?
Well, the next thing at 6:25, they were in the two gardai were in the room, Detective Sergeant Jennings and Detective Sergeant Nugent, and she gave a true copy of the warrant to Mr Puska, and they rang as you remember, they rang an interpreter earlier, and Sergeant Jennings rang the same interpreter, and they went through the game. Basically, Detective Sergeant Nugent introduced herself and said they had a warrant to seize his clothes, and Sergeant Jennings explained the warrant in simple terms to him, and seized his phone and clothing in the ward, and came back to take part in the interview.
Okay, and when they engaged in this interview, then from reading your coverage of this, and we've heard a bit about this in the outset of the trial, that Mr Puska began to make a level of admissions almost straight away. But it began with him asking, was he a suspect in this case?
Yeah, essentially what happened was Detective Sergeant Nugent said, "Look, do you know anything? Did you hear about? We're investigating a murder in Tullamore on Wednesday. Have you heard anything about it?" And Mr Puska said he'd read about it in the news. So then essentially they leapt straight in, and Mr Puska said, "Am I a suspect?" So then Detective Sergeant Jennings said no, and he said, "I said he was a person of interest." So after that there was a pause, and he started talking to the interpreter. So he's speaking Slovakian to the interpreter via the speakerphone.
And in that, we then heard, as I said, we've heard from the outset of the trial that Mr Puska allegedly said through the interpreter, "I did it, I murdered, I am the murderer." And then Detective Sergeant Jennings, what did he do after that?
He immediately cautioned him, and the witness asked the interpreter, or I think he asked Mr Puska, was he admitting to murder? And Mr Puska said yes. And then Mr Puska said, "I feel guilty and say that I regretted it." And he said he was, quotes, pleading guilty because he did not want anything to happen to his family. Now, Detective Sergeant Jennings said that while the interpreter and he were talking, I suppose, he was writing down Mr Puska's comments. So he wrote down the comments, and on an A4 pad, he said, and invited Mr Puska to sign it. He also offered him a solicitor. Mr Puska said he would take one, but he didn't know one. So then, as I said, he offered him the statement to sign, and he said he took the pen out of my hand and signed it. And at that stage, again, Detective Sergeant Jennings reminded him that he was under caution.
Okay, and just in relation to what he was saying, Mr Puska was saying that he was concerned for his own family, and then he mentioned the family of Ashling Murphy. Is that right? And that he thought that they would in some way harm him.
Yes. So just seconds before that, Mr Puska, through the interpreter, is alleged to have said when he committed the murder, he didn't do it intentionally. But then he said that he was concerned the family of the girl, his words, would harm his family. But Sergeant Jennings told him that Ashling's family was a good family and would not harm him. And he said that Mr Puska reiterated how sorry he was, and he didn't do it intentionally. And again, the sergeant reminded him that he was under caution. But Puska also said, according to the sergeant, that he expressed concern. He wanted to know would his name and his address be published.
And the Garda obviously was asked about Mr Puska's demeanour at this point in time, and I think he said that at one stage he can recall that Mr Puska was upset.
Yeah, he said he was upset and he was crying. Now, immediately after that, Sergeant Jennings said he left the room to call colleagues in Tullamore, which is as I say, the investigation based. And the Gardaí started getting the process of getting Mr Puska a solicitor, and he said officers from Kilmainham, which would be the nearest Garda station to St James's, started doing that. And Sergeant Jennings went back into the room with Sergeant Nugent, and Garda Hogan was in there as well. He and Sergeant Jennings, essentially, when he was speaking to Tullamore Gardaí, he was instructed not to have any more dealings with Mr Puska. So he went back in, got Garda Hogan out, and there was a Garda placed outside the door.
Okay, was it explained in court? I might be putting you on the spot here now, but as to why he was told not to have another engagement?
No, that wasn't it. I'll just jump slightly forward. Pamela Nugent, as we said, was also involved in this, and she also rang Tullamore Garda Station, spoke to senior officers, and she said, look, after this admission, should we arrest him? And the response from a senior investigator was, don't arrest him and don't ask any more questions.
Okay, and then there was cross-examination from Michael Bowman, where he just asked kind of general basic details first. Was there anything that Mr. Bowman just asked the witness that was of interest?
Look, he was really asking him things like, for example, when he was talking to Mr. Puska, did you say words, something along the lines of, because he phrased it twice in different ways, is there anything you can tell us, or is there anything you want to tell us about the murder in Tullamore? And Sergeant Jennings repeatedly said that he didn't say that. He basically said, we're investigating a murder in Tullamore. Have you heard about it? But he repeatedly said that he didn't say, do you want to tell us about it, or is there anything you would like to talk to about? But he did also say one point of interest. You'll know, and listeners will know, that previously another man was arrested and released without charge, and is released without charge on the night of the 13th. So that was around the same time that they were driving back from St James's to Tullamore, and he said he heard about that, and he said he thinks it was about 11 o'clock, and he thinks it was on the news, and that's how he heard it.
Okay. Mr. Bowman told the witness that the Gardaí had been called to the hospital to, as he said, see what the suspect looks like, and that was, he understands the reason why he was dispatched to the hospital in the first place.
Well, yeah, and he said he's not aware of the other officer's notes, but he did say, I took it as the reason I was being dispatched to the hospital was to take a look at this man and to speak to him. He said he does not recall being asked to look, but it was a natural thing to do. He said he was not specifically asked to look and, see what Mr. Puska looked like, he said. Okay. And the other point was he was asked, just what Mr. Bowman said, that you call him a person of interest, but another senior officer's note says the word suspect, and he says, no, not to me. It was a person of interest.
So the next witness then was Detective Sergeant Pamela Nugent, who also attended the hospital, and we heard mention of her, but she was then next to the stand, and she gave her evidence about what she witnessed in the hospital with Mr. Puska.
Yes, so she appeared. She wasn't there for the morning interview. As I said, she went to the court to get secure a warrant to search the hospital, to seize items from the hospital in relation to Mr. Puska. So she got there about 6:25, and she a lot of her evidence is repeating what Detective Sergeant Jennings was said, because they were both in the room when it's alleged that Mr. Puska made his confession. But as I said, she did, before going into Mr. Puska, or slightly after going into Mr. Puska, she did show him the warrant, but she did say that she went back to his ward, his public ward, and she retrieved property from his ward before going back to the room. So that was, as I said, a grey Nokia phone, a yellow patient bag, a Santa bag that she said had clothes in it, and a clear plastic wallet that had a Slovakian ID and a COVID cert on it. Now, so she went back into the room and she gave the same version of what happened. But then, now she wasn't taking notes at the time, but she says she went downstairs, she had a spare bit of paper and took notes. But during the alleged confession, she says that Mr Puska did start to cry a little, and she was asking things like, as Detective Sergeant Jennings says, would his name and address get out? What is the girl's family like? So she essentially mirrored what Detective Sergeant Jennings was saying.
And she described the process to the court of that interview and just the pace of it. I think she described it as being a slow process, and that she could actually recall there being a long pause when Mr Puska was asked a particular thing.
Yes, and that was an interesting point she said, because so she was effectively, she wasn't, as I said, Detective Sergeant Jennings was writing down the notes, so she was sort of an active bystander, shall we say, and she was observing more. She wasn't having to write, and she did say that I could see him thinking, and he was looking at me, and then he was looking at Detective Sergeant Jennings, and then looking at me, so you could see. Now, she was asked in the cross-examination, did you think he was going to confess? She said, I didn't have any real thoughts as to what he was going to do. And then she said, my suspicion was he was actually going to say, please leave the room.
Okay. And she, as you said, she kind of reiterated a lot of her colleague's story, Detective Garda Jennings' story, about the crying and about the caution. She says she left the room to contact Tullamore, and she asked if Mr Puska should be arrested. And as we've said, she was told no, and not to ask any further questions. Is there anything more from that witness, or shall we move on?
No, let's move on to Detective Garda Hogan.
So the next witness then was Detective Garda Fergus Hogan.
Yes, so he was with Detective Sergeant Jennings on the first night that they both went to St James's Hospital, and also on the 14th when they had the initial interview with Mr Puska. Okay, but then this is where they sort of diverge. You will have heard that Detective Sergeant Jennings and Detective Sergeant Nugent were in the room when it's alleged that Mr Puska made his confession or admission. Detective Garda Hogan wasn't there. He was outside. Detective Sergeant Jennings had directed him to stay outside. But then Sergeant Jennings called him at 18:37. The interview started at 18:25, so for 12 minutes he was outside. Then Detective Garda Jennings told him to come in. He came in, and Detective Sergeant Jennings was there with Detective Sergeant Nugent, and the interpreter was still on the phone. Very quickly, the interpreter, the call ended with the interpreter. Sergeant Jennings and Sergeant Nugent both left the room, and Detective Garda Hogan was left alone with Mr Puska in the room, and then he gives an account of what he says happened and what his notes say happened.
Okay. And I have those quotes here if you want me to read them out
Yeah, I will. I'll just make one point that at the very start, Detective Garda Hogan said that he didn't ask any questions to Mr Puska. Mr Puska quotes, he started speaking to me.
Yes. And Mr Puska, he said to him, I see girl I never see before. I have knife I have used for chain on bike. I tell her, no, I won't hurt you. When she pass, I cut her neck. She panic, I panic. He then said that he asked Mr. Puska, he then said Mr. Puska said, and then it happened, and he asked the question, will I go for 10 years? And he responded to him saying, I can't answer that, Jozef.
Yes, and that was basically the thrust. He said shortly after that, Detective Sergeant Jennings came back in. He told him, we're leaving. So, but Garda Hogan did stress about Mr. Puska. He volunteered all this to me. I did not ask any questions. And he did say that he wrote down the comments as best he could. But he did say of Mr. Puska, he was upset. He was crying. His English was enough so that I could understand.
Mm-hmm. And then just, I suppose, briefly, just earlier in the day, the first witness of the day was Garda Conor Newman, and we did hear about Conor Newman yesterday, just in relation to his colleague who had attended the hospital to meet with Mr. Puska, and this was all in relation to the alleged stabbing in Blanchardstown shopping centre. And Garda Newman was involved in attending the hospital on that night of the 13th as well. And he thought he had been the victim of that stabbing, is that right? And he was actually the Garda who organised for the translator over the phone so they could speak to Mr. Puska that evening.
Yes. So, and he told him that he'd gone to Blanchardstown to meet a girl. We've been through that, and Garda Newman asked him where in Blanche, and he said it's about 1 kilometre from the centre in a field near an apartment block.
Mm-hmm. And they weren't happy with his answers. He said that he thought that they were vague.
Yes. So we were not really satisfied with his story. He said there were holes in it, and while they were asking some questions, he said, as you say, they were vague. He was asked, the witness asked, for example, who had brought him back who brought him from Dublin to Tullamore on the day of the 12th. He said he winced, then the monitor went off and the interview ended. So we were not really satisfied with their story. There were holes in it. We had nothing to work off, really. So he met with Inspector Shane McCartan, and I think we might go through his evidence now.
Yeah, so Shane McCartan, we heard brief mention of him as well yesterday, and I think the information was relayed back to him when the two Gardaí left the hospital, and then that they had actually, I think Mr. McCartan, Inspector McCartan, was actually the one who we heard made the connection ultimately between what had happened in Tullamore and Mr. Puska. Did we hear about that in the court today?
Yeah, he actually was the senior officer. He was the detective sergeant in Blanchardstown at the time. He told the court he's now an inspector, uniform inspector in the Dublin Regional Control Unit. So whenever you get your 999 calls. But he said he tasked Garda Paul McDonald and Garda Paul Newman to go to St. James's and talk to Mr. Puska. They reported back to him late in the afternoon of the 13th. He said he assessed the information. I interacted with both Gardaí. They briefed me in relation to the conversation. It was apparent that there was a dearth of real cogent information. And then he said he was aware of Mr. Puska's nationality and that he lived in Tullamore. And he says there was a lot of information, a lot of pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that just could not be put together. Mm-hmm.
So he was the Garda who made the first connection between Mr. Puska then and what had happened in Tullamore. And obviously we know what happened after that with all of the witnesses we've just heard from and the interviews they had then with Mr. Puska.
And he discussed it with his boss. Sorry, I just finished. He did discuss it with his boss, but then he came to the conclusion that the information he had from Garda McDonald and Newman may be of assistance to the team in Tullamore. So he contacted Tullamore Garda Station at 6:40 p.m. on the 13th of January.
Okay, it's very interesting. It's all Garda witnesses today, but as you can see, hopefully you can see why we did it in the order we did it. But all of those witnesses effectively tell the story of the interviews with Mr. Puska in the hospital and the central allegation by the prosecution that he made this confession to the murder of Ashling Murphy. Now, it's worth noting that he has pleaded not guilty to the murder of Miss Murphy. And so I'm sure we'll hear more evidence in relation to what Mr. Puska has to say about those interactions. But for now, that is the evidence as it was today. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah, long day, but we're back again tomorrow, Paul. I think you're going to be in attendance.
I will indeed. Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much. And thank you to Kieran Bradley, our producer.
Thanks, Kieran.